Welcome back to another episode of Books in Review. I'm your host, Stephen Heiner, and with us for this episode is His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn. Hello, Your Excellency.
Hello, Stephen.
We were reflecting before this episode of just what an important work this is. This is Work of Human Hands, a theological critique of the Mass of Paul VI by Father Anthony Cekada, and the fact that it's become a reference work even for people who are not sedevacantists.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
When I first started reading this book, Your Excellency, I was just struck by how much ground Father had to cover. What has become chapter 9 in this book was originally a small pamphlet issued by TAN, which was the problem with the prayers of the modern Mass. Mm-hmm. And that sold like hotcakes, apparently. I think there was second printing or third printing, but it's just one chapter in this book. And I suppose the proximate event to this, so the Motu Mass came out in 2007. Father Cekada publishes this in 2010. I want to go back to 2007 when the Motu comes out. What were your thoughts at that time? What did you think was going to happen now that the traditional Latin Mass had been permitted?
I thought that it would be a placebo, so to speak, that an attempt to somehow put, as the saying goes, lipstick on the pig. In other words, that the Novus Ordo can coexist with tradition, and the only thing that we need is the traditional Mass. That people will be attracted to that they can be part of the Novus Ordo and have the traditional Mass, and that is poison. The problem, as I always say, is Vatican II, and everything, all the effluent from Vatican II. That is the problem. It's a dogmatic problem. The liturgical problem is a symptom of that. And so to just say, well, we're going to have the traditional Latin Mass in the context of the Novus Ordo is I thought, poison. And Father Ricosa pointed out that the reasons that were alleged for permitting it were modernist. You see that your sensitivities, this corresponds to your sensitivities, so like your personal interior needs. See, it wasn't that, well, the new Mass is bad or deficient in any way. It's just that people are sensitive to, they like Latin better. It was given for a modernist reason.
Well, accompanying modernist terms referring to an extraordinary right and an ordinary right.
Yes, an extraordinary right. Here, the right from the early ages of the Church becomes extraordinary, where that thing that was concocted by Bugnini, and make sure you can pronounce that correctly, Bugnini, was that's the ordinary thing that was concocted, just made up by that Freemason.
Well, we're almost 20 years on from that Motu getting that way. What has been, so that was what you thought at the time. Mm-hmm. Now that you've had plenty of time to observe, have you been mostly right?
I think so. There's a whole group of people now, and many congregations that have come out of that and have grown out of that Motu, and where people go to the traditional Latin Mass under the auspices of the Novus Ordo. And they are like high Anglicans, you see. In other words, they're Novus Ordo. Most of them, I think. In other words, or at least they're happy with the Novus Ordo. They do not object to the Novus Ordo. When I say the Novus Ordo, I mean the whole religion, not just the Novus Ordo Mass. The whole Vatican II new religion. They are at least okay with it, see. But they want their world in the corner and not be bothered with the insult of the new Mass. And that is not Catholicism. Catholicism is one. It is the same for everybody. And you're not going to solve any problems in the Church merely by, like an ostrich, putting your head in the sand and not looking around at the rest of what is going on. So it's just ritualism. Ritualism means that you concentrate on the ritual, and everything else about it is Protestant, or that was the High Anglican ritualism. And you see that with those congregations, as I said in I think someplace else. They do everything perfectly, more perfectly than anything was ever done before Vatican II as far as liturgy. Everything perfect. And that was so typical of the High Anglicans too, that all they had was liturgy. The rest of it
I think
was,
you were remarking on the music and the vestments that you saw
Yes.
one online and you thought,
I wish I had a choir like that. I wish I had vestments like that, a church like that. There was some church in Italy, it was beautiful. And that's all they have, you know. It's all the icing on the cake, but the cake underneath doesn't taste very good, you know. And so, you know, I call it metropolitan opera in the sense that they have all of the uniforms and costumes of truth, but it's just a show. There's nothing underneath it. See, those things only have meaning when they're the clothing of truth. Then they have meaning. Then, you know, the magnificent vestment, etc., has meaning when it is the clothing of truth. But if it's just the clothing of falsehood, it's just like a show at the Metropolitan Opera. The Metropolitan Opera is always known for its big production and its costumes.
as Father is building his argument early on, he talks about the liturgical movement, and people don't realize that Dom Granger, who's a reference work for many of us every day liturgically, was considered part of this liturgical movement, Your Excellency, and there was a good portion of liturgical movement and a bad portion of liturgical movement, and part of getting ready to foist the new Mass on everybody was effectively hijacking the good side of the liturgical movement. What was the liturgical movement, Your Excellency?
Well, the early liturgical movement that was spearheaded by Dom Granger and others was an attempt to appreciate the sacred liturgy, the traditional liturgy of the Church, and he explained it wonderfully in his work, and other works, but the liturgical year. So there was this renewed interest. Many works that were produced. Even in the 18th century, there were a number of authors describing the Mass and explaining the Mass, and so that was wonderful. That the people understand the Mass. The Council of Trent, back in the 1500s, said that the priest should explain the rites of the Mass to the people. You know, that in the sermons, actually in the council. You know, so yeah, that's wonderful, and that people appreciate it. That they understand the texts of the Mass. You know, there are many things in the Mass that are difficult to understand, even for priests. You know, you have to study it. And but then. That went awry after Pius X. You see, the Pius X repressed and suppressed the Modernists, and they were operating in the area of sacred scripture and dogma. Well, when that happened, they decided to surface later by means of the liturgy, that the liturgy would be the vehicle of the modernism. And that was in the early 1920s, even the late teens, under Benedict XV. You see, Benedict XV lifted all of or most of the measures which repressed modernism. He was elected as a moderate. And that meant that was the party that thought that Pius X was going too hard on the modernists. And they're not really bad people, but you just need to instruct them a little bit. It was a disaster. Right? We are living that disaster today. So they managed to rise in that period. For example, Paul VI in 1926, this is under Pius XI, was cited by his superiors, he was a young priest, for saying Mass facing the people in Milan. I'm saying. Benedict XV did a dialogue Mass in St. Peter's Basilica, and Pius XI did too. So there was this, then you had various people, I forget his name right now, who actually said that the road to ecumenism must be done through the liturgy. Very famous, I just can't remember his name right now, very famous monk that was, who said, right before the election of John the 23rd, after Pius XII died, that what we need is a pope who will consecrate ecumenism. He was very ecumenical, and the way in which to become ecumenical and dissolve the differences between religions was through the liturgy. If I can remember his name after this interview,
we'll put it in
name.
We'll put it in the description.
But there were a whole bunch of people like that. I had a priest tell me, he passed away ever since, when I was still a seminarian. He said that when he was a young priest in the late 40s, that there were these shops in New York, and you would go in and you would hear chant in English, and all of the books were, trendy new liturgy books, or with things that you should know about the Mass and future reform and all of this. Yes, he said you could see it coming. His expression was they were waiting in the wings until they got John the 23rd, that the whole thing was ready, waiting in the wings, and then they brought it all out. So that's what was happening. The dialogue Mass, for example, became actually traditional in France and in Europe in general. It never took on here. We did not see it until early 1960s. But the French saw it in the 20s and the 30s, so much so that they think it's traditional. And so when we object to the dialogue Mass in Europe,
you're objecting to their childhood.
This is what we did since I was a child, but it really has no tradition whatsoever in the Catholic Church that people should be screaming the responses.
When you tell grandma, it's just as bad now as it was in the 1920s.
But you see, that was the idea that the people are not really participating unless they're screaming responses. See, people are participating if they are acting with what the priest is doing and offering their personal sacrifices with the priest at the altar. And they do that actually by, in the 19th century, they didn't have missals, they had prayer books that expressed all of that. That the principal participation of the layperson is interior, not in responses. The altar boys can just nicely do the responses. That you are saying these things back to the priest is very superficial. What you're doing inside and understanding what the priest is doing is essential. You see, and I think people in the 19th century understood more what the Mass was than the people screaming the responses in the 30s and the 40s.
Father also talks about the art and architecture and the music that surrounds this, that if you put the Novus Ordo inside St. Patrick's Cathedral, people are still going to have some sort of Catholic notion, but you have to explode that. You have to bring in a table, you have to move the tabernacle to a side altar sanctuary out of the way, you have to put on ugly vestments. There's all these other changes that have to come. It's not enough to change the Mass. You basically have to change the architecture, the universe that surrounds the Mass.
Yeah, he always Father Cekada always said the Pizza Hut church. Yeah, and yes, there was a cultivation of the ugly. It started in the 1940s, the ugly modern. I mean, there were some churches put up in the 1950s that are just disgusting, frankly.
Do you remember seeing them when you were a young person?
Yes, some.
And what was your reaction?
I thought they were horrible.
Did you feel like you could articulate that? That you could say, "Oh, I think this is really ugly," or did you just?
Well,
keep that
when
to
you're young, you just say that's an ugly piece of, But fortunately, my church, although built in the 50s, wasn't too bad. But I thinking back, I remember certain things about it that were influenced with like that. But certain churches just, so especially the ones that went up in the suburbs, that happened in Detroit when Detroit became more or less unlivable. A lot of churches went up in the suburbs. The suburbs exploded after the war in Detroit. I don't think there's one nice church in all of the suburbs of Detroit. I can't think of a single one.
Well, you spent many years there, so I figured you would have seen a few.
You drive by one after the other, and they're all A-frame, ugly churches, and just terrible. But the Novus Ordo has a love of the ugly.
Well, and it corresponds in this. A very famous someone had quoted back to me when you had visited Father Oswald Baker many years ago in England. They said at the time, Father Sanborn looked at the cathedral in Ely, said, "It's beautiful, but replete with the trappings of heresy." And this was the quote that they gave back to me. What did you mean by that? Because this is a very old church, and they still share something in common with these A-frames, I suppose.
Well, you could just see the trappings of heresy all through the building, and also the beautiful Lady Chapel where the Puritans, not the Protestants, not the original Reformation, but the Puritans went with hammer and smashed all of it. So now it's just all plain glass. It's just, you'd have to be an animal to do that, in my opinion. But that hatred, see, so. Yes, you just knew that you were very much in a non-Catholic church, although the trappings of Catholicism were all around you too. So. That's
It's
true
very-
of every Anglican
Well,
cathedral.
it's so confusing. Do you remember when we went to Canterbury and outside you have Cranmer carved into the stone, and then inside that martyr to papism, so, St. Thomas Becket is enshrined.
Yes,
Very
yes.
confusing.
And all it's many Anglican cathedrals. I noticed St. Gregory the Great, who was a papist after all, he was Pope. A statue of St. Gregory, he sent St. Augustine to, and so a bunch of papists. I saw St. Joan of Arc in there,
replete with papists.
Yes. Which makes no sense whatsoever.
As we said, I said at this beginning, watchers and listeners, that we're doing a traditional book review, and the fact that Father Cekada actually not only did he write this, not only are there summaries at the end of each chapter for those of us who weren't paying attention when we were reading the chapters, he made it really easy for us by summarizing the chapters at the end, but he also created a video series in which he goes through each chapter, which we'll link to in the description below. So we're not going to go through all that today. As I say, I just wanted to reflect with His Excellency on what he remembered about this process on his own. And I suppose I would conclude by saying, Your Excellency, one of the big shockers, quote unquote, when this book came out that caused a lot of controversy with the Novus Ordo was his conclusion that the Novus Ordo is an invalid mass in its right. So it doesn't matter that you have a valid minister because the rite is invalid. Did you suspect that prior to reading Father's book? I don't think there had been too many works out there that had postulated that yet.
Well, everyone concentrated on the words of consecration, and especially the removal of mysterium fidei from the words of the consecration of the precious blood. And so people thought, does that invalidate and so forth? In the Eastern rites, they never had it, but it is also true that there are differences of form from the Eastern rites, like a form of consecration in the Eastern rites is different. Confirmation in the Eastern rites is different from what it is in the Western rite. So that is inconclusive that it was absent in the Eastern rites. So that was because if you leave out something that, a notable part and what is considered essential, and that would have been considered essential, all the traditional theology, the Mysterium Fidei, you would have to repeat the whole thing if you left it out, that it was at least dubious. But what the clincher was that was the term, the institution narrative. See, if you pronounce those words merely as a narrative, as if you're talking about what happened at the Last Supper, that's a certainly invalid mass.
And why is that, Your Excellency?
It's because you must pronounce the words, the term is enunciatively. That means you are saying that this thing, hoc, is the body of Christ, and mean it and declare it. You see, not merely that you're telling a story. For example, on the Feast of Corpus Christi, you're over at reading the epistle, and St. Paul goes through the whole Mass, all the words of consecration, everything, and the chalice and host are there. You're just narrating it there. You see, it's only a few feet from you, the chalice and host, but you're not saying that declaratively. You're just narrating like a story, like Robin Hood or something, and it's not to make it, but in a sense, it could be any story.
Just a story.
You see, but when you're consecrating it, you're declaring this thing is this, you see, and that's key. All of the theologians before the council said if you recite that merely narratively, then it's certainly invalid.
And I suppose you can see this visually, Your Excellency. I mean, lay people can see it in their hand missal, but for priests, it's on the altar card and it's in the missal. It's set aside. It's all, not all caps, but it's in this big, bold font. It's set apart, and we're going to say this thing, and there's a pause for you all before you say it.
Yes. I mean, the consecration is in the traditional Mass is the center of it. I mean, when that's going on. The priest is very careful about it. He bows down. He says the words correctly. He's very conscious of that. It's not merely a narrative, but in the new missal, they call it the institution narrative. And that would corrupt the intention of the priest if he's saying that merely narratively, and
that he's reciting a story.
He's reciting a story. And that is a false and invalidating intention.
And that flows down to potential candidates for the priesthood. They think that their job is to go up and recite a story as opposed to make a sacrifice. That's
Yes.
what the real meaning of the Mass is.
Yes, and then subsequently they treat the Blessed Sacrament as if it's just a piece of bread and wine, just some wine. If you see the way the new Mass proceeds, in the traditional Mass, the priest genuflects, there's the bells, there's the elevation, genuflection again. I mean, in the churches ring their bells to let everybody know that the consecration is that you know that something very, very important has taken place. You watch the new Mass, even the conservative new Mass. It's just this is the body of Christ, and then he puts it down. This is my body. Boom. And nothing happens.
Well, it's just one genuflection, right? I think potentially.
At the end of the whole thing, there's one genuflection after the so-called consecration.
So there's not a double genuflection. It's been so long.
No,
since
there's
I've been
just
to-
one genuflection after you're all through. And this is in the canon that takes about maybe 1 minute to say. Now, before you get to there's 1 minute, I think, before you get to the consecration.
Well, but Father Cekada referred to Eucharistic prayer too as the fastest epiclesis in the West.
That was the one written on the back of a napkin by Louis Boyer, who was one of the evil liturgists
Part of the
Novus
liturgical
Ordo
movement.
liturgists. He was in a restaurant and wrote that on the back of a napkin. That's where that comes from.
And Father Cekada talks about Louis Boyer in chapter 2.
Yes.
I mean, and the misplacement there, actually, then you say mystery of faith after, and then it's this Christ has died, Christ
has died.
Right after you've done this consecration, you've now removed these words and put it in this very strange place.
Yes, the mystery of faith is obviously the Blessed Sacrament, because there is nothing except the faith that assures you of that. See, Christ has died. That's a historical fact. That he rose from the dead is a historical fact. That he will come again, yes, that's faith. But it is not the mystery of faith means that the only thing that draws me to say that this is the body of Christ is faith. Everything else, senses tell me it's merely bread and wine. See? So it's faith. That's the mystery of faith.
Is that also an allusion to the fact that this was kept secret from catechumens when they were going through the process in the early church, that they had to be told?
That was the discipline of the secret. I don't know. St. Thomas says that mystery of faith is of apostolic origin.
So this very explosive conclusion, I remember Father Cekada told me that someone had told him there are Fraternity of St. Peter seminarians who don't want to read the book because they don't want to come to the conclusions and they think that they might be persuaded, which I suppose is one way to handle things. You're actually the ostrich approach, see no evil, hear no evil.
Yes, that is known as affected ignorance, which is not good.
I think about this work in combination with his work on Episcopal consecration, because what we have here, and it was Father Karl Provelmacher who said, they'll allow the Latin Mass when they don't have any more priests, something like that. And I tend to think of those two as a double whammy. Father Cekada's most important contributions and gifts to us, that he conclusively proved what many people had suspected over the years. And that's the second question I'm going to pose to you. Same thing as I did with the Mass. What were your suspicions prior to Father Cekada's publishing that work on Episcopal consecration?
Again, it was one of doubt. There was not a lot of deep research on it. The first indication that I had was from Archbishop Lefebvre himself, when I was pretty sure a seminarian. He said, I think that the new rite of ordination of priests is doubtful, but the new rite of consecration of bishops is invalid. And I said to him, you mean doubtful? No, he said invalid. I remember that distinctly because I was shocked.
You were in a hallway in a cone or something?
No, I was sitting in his office. And he said, I think it's invalid. And I brought that up to him in 1983 when they were preparing to become part of the Novus Ordo and everything like that. That's why we split with them. And I said to Archbishop Lefebvre, but you yourself told me that the new rite of consecration is invalid. And he said, well, apparently it's valid. And he pointed to Father Schmidberger, who said, yes, it's an Eastern rite. And so, I don't know. I never researched it that much, but I always had a lot of doubt about it. Let's put it that way. And but Father Cekada researched it a great deal. He was a great researcher. He looked up stuff. And he found that it was the formula for the installation of a patriarch who had already been consecrated. And that's why it refers to the founding of churches. See, and that's the new theology of bishops, is that their episcopacy is one of jurisdiction. Every bishop has jurisdiction, whether you're a bishop of a diocese or just an ordinary auxiliary bishop. You are consecrated as somebody who is going to rule the church. That is all new, and it's a heresy. And whenever a rite reflects a heresy, it is certainly invalid. That's Catholic teaching.
We'll put a link to that. So that Father never wrote a book about that, but there's lots of important studies, so we'll put a link to that in the description as well. Your Excellency, but I do think this is one of Father's, maybe his greatest gift to us.
Yes. He said it took him 30 years to write everything. And he taught liturgy at the seminary, and he did a great work in doing that. He asked me to proofread it. And I would sit on the plane proofreading it, and I would start laughing. Because he was so funny. He says all sorts of things in there, and people would stare at me, and I was laughing like crazy. And the other note that I made to him, he always used popular expressions, and I said to him, "Please, I write, please have mercy on your translators."
Because things don't work out as well.
They don't say that way. What does that mean in English? But he always used popular expressions, Father Cekada. But it's an easy read. It's not a dull read at all. That work. It's a wonderful work, and I'm just sorry that he's not around to enjoy it in a sense, or to contribute more.
Well, and there'll be a link to where you can purchase the book in the description. But also, don't worry if you are a French or Italian speaker, the book's in translation in both of those languages.
Yes. So
don't have to worry. Those translators did
Although
get through.
There is a bogus Polish
Yes.
translation, and that is not authorized.
His Excellency was told about that in Poland last summer, that some SSPXers went through and then they changed some of Father's conclusions conveniently.
Which is terrible to do. Yes.
So beware of the Polish translation. It's not only not authorized, but it's also
altered.
Yes. But the Italian and the French.
Yes.
I think Father also had a lot of involvement with
he did. Yes.
with the Italian French. Yes. So Work of Human Hands, a Theological Critique of the Mass of Paul VI by Father Anthony Cekada. This falls under the recommend in this series.
Oh, definitely. I couldn't recommend that more highly than I do.
And I think some lay people might be intimidated by some of the language, but I point to the fact that you can just go to the summaries of each chapter, and Father Cekada puts it in very simple, easy to understand language. So if you feel intimidated, look at the summaries. Or if you want, you can start with Father's video series in which he breaks down each chapter for you. And we'll be back for another episode in the future of Books in Review. Thank you for your time, Your Excellency.
Thank you.